Utopia, as you know, it was in our top 50 shows of the decade, really high up. It's one we've always championed. It's one of the most...
Was in my Desert Island Dramas.
It was, yeah, and it's one of the most exciting, innovative, visually stunning shows the UK has ever made, I would say. Certainly in the time we've been making this podcast, there's been nothing that rivals Utopia in terms of storytelling, visual, graded, everything about it is so unique.
I think we were talking last week about the Ryan Murphy, the visual aesthetic and the stark colour palette. Utopia definitely had that going for it. The bright colours, the comic book aesthetic. And the story was just like, it was something you don't really see on British TV. It felt very otherworldly.
And I will be honest with you, because this is my platform for honesty. I wasn't one of those people who said, the Americans shouldn't remake it. I was quite excited by the idea.
I don't think I was either.
No, I was quite excited by the idea of a US remake, because I thought they would just make it louder and brighter and brasher and quicker and firing on all cylinders and turned up the volume on. And their version is the complete opposite of that, in a way. It would surprise me. Were you able to go into this with fairly open mind?
I was trying to. I suppose a little bit of housekeeping is that this has been sort of touted for a while, hasn't it? It was initially David Fincher, I believe, was the person who was going to be involved.
Yeah, and it was going to be at HBO initially with David Fincher.
And
they parted company because he wanted more money to spend on it. And HBO basically said, no, you can't have that.
And there was also a completely different cast that was signed up, including Rooney Mara, Eric McCormack, Agnes Dean, oddly. It was a completely different kettle of fish, and I wonder if that would be a little bit different. I mean, I don't think if you know the source material that you can go into something with a completely open mind. I was mentioning last week about Talking Heads and how people were comparing the old version with the new version. I think with a show like Utopia, which is so special, at least to us, that you are comparing certainly what have they done similar, what have they done different, what have they kept. And in the case, I mean, I'll do a little bit of setup, shall I?
Go ahead.
In terms of this. So both the series of Utopia are based around the fictional comic book of the same name, which was created by a gentleman who was writing about the story of a scientist and his daughter Jessica Hyde. People think it's spelling out things that will happen in the future, or it's got answers to questions they want to ask. And I couldn't for the life of me remember how in the initial one, how they find the comic book. In this version, it's a couple who move into her granddad's house, was it?
Her granddad leaves at this house.
Yeah.
And it's a right state, and they find the comic amongst all of his belongings. They don't really understand the origins to it, and they just try and sell it within a Comic-Con setup. Which
is the difference, isn't it? This Comic-Con thing, all the sort of the ensembled characters, who most of whom are created from the British version. So we've got Ian, Becky, Wilson, and Grant, as well as a new character, Samantha, who is sort of almost the link between all of these people. They communicate via a group talking about the previous comic Dystopia, and then when Utopia is found, they all agree to go to this Comic-Con to bid on it, and Samantha's going to give the biggest bid and try and get it. Grant, like it is in the UK version, they think he's an adult, but is a child.
I think he's a fashion photographer.
Yeah.
And he's a young lad.
And again, that's very similar to, I suppose the biggest difference in the first episode was that the events happen at a Comic-Con, so there's a lot more humour to be had, and when the violence comes, the body count is higher. By the end, there's Arby, who was Neil Maskell's character in the original, and his associate, who go around trying to find Utopia and basically killing almost everybody apart from our primary players who have actually seen the comic. And from there, Jessica Hyde appears and tries to help them escape the clutches of these assassins. I suppose let's talk about this first episode first and what we liked.
It's a bit like you last week with us. Having read it, you couldn't look at it
No.
through the
And
eyes of the review.
I don't think you can, and I think an interesting question is, would you have felt differently had it not been a remake?
Let's talk about the things
Yeah.
that they didn't do that I wish they'd done. So
Okay.
the color palette that was stunning and so instantly Utopia and instantly memorable isn't there at all, apart from the yellow bag that our two villains carry around. Everything is quite beige, quite muted. It's not as visually stunning to look at. The characters don't feel as well drawn either. They feel quite thin to me. And it took a while to get going. If I didn't know what this was about and where it was going, I may have mentally checked out earlier than I did. But obviously, we have the hindsight of that. It wasn't particularly gripping. It didn't feel, the episode was longer than the first episode of our original, and it really
Not by
felt,
much, though, really.
Not by much, but it just felt like a bit of a slog until you got to the violence. I enjoyed the violence because that's what felt like Utopia. The rest of it was quite slow and took a while to get going.
It held my attention a little bit more than I think it did you, by the sounds of things. I think the performers they chose were an interesting bunch. I really like Dan Bird. I'm glad to see him on. He played Ian. And actually, the girl who played Becky as well, Ashley Lathrop, who I've not heard of before, and I thought she did a good job here. I think for me, and you mentioned the violence, and I saw Alan Sepinwall, who's one of your favourites, mention that he just found the violence far too much. I think the difference between the violence in our version and the violence here was that a lot of it was almost played for laughs, and there was a lot more of it because we had this Comic-Con set up, and we had Arby and the other guy whose name, sorry, I can't remember, basically shooting every single person at this Comic-Con, and it was done for sort of
it had a musical accompaniment, and some were in costumes, humorous costumes, and
and then into the second episode where, and I can't remember. I think they did call Wilson live with his dad. I think in the first
original
one. And did they kill him in a similar way that they gassed him? The violence there felt a lot bigger and a lot different than the violence in our version when it happened was quite shocking. And I think they tried to recreate the moment in the second episode where Wilson has his eye removed, which is like one of the key scenes, which if you are going to keep in, if you are going to remake this, it is something that you are going to keep in because that is sort of integral to the character of Wilson.
What it didn't have is it didn't have our level of intrigue. If you remember that opening sequence where LB and his mate go into the comic book store and they're just repeating, "Where is Jessica Hyde?" and they slowly sort of gas everybody in that establishment. As a viewer, you're like, what the devil's going on? Who are these people? You feel uncomfortable watching it, nervous watching it. There's a sense of unease, and this was very point A, point B, point C. There's never that Utopia atmosphere where you're never really sure what you're watching. Dennis Kelly's script was always a step ahead of you, and this was like going on a journey with them from the start to the finish, and I didn't enjoy that as much.
And there was a lot of expository dialogue, so I wanted to talk about Sasha Lane as Jessica Hyde because I really like Sasha Lane, and she was in a film called American Honey, which I don't think you've seen.
No.
And I was interested because the first episode ends the same way our episode ends, with I'm Jessica Hyde and her coming into it. I didn't feel that she was right for the role.
No,
I think
agree.
Fiona O'Shaughnessy was a lot more captivating, and Sasha Lane.
She was otherworldly.
Sasha Lane is a good actress, but is good at playing like vulnerable characters, and I didn't feel she had that leadership quality, that believability that she's been living off grid for years and has re-emerged because Utopia has
that is a tough
again.
Character to get right. You've got to be warm and cold at the same time, and you've got to be otherworldly but believable. You've got to have a panicked side to you. It's
and I think she's just a little bit too young for me anyway, because her and Arby are meant to be of a similar age. And while we're on it as well, the performance of Christopher Denham as Arby I found very hard to get a handle on, because Neil Maskell's performance is very childlike in our version, and they made
him look like Neil Maskell, and he does look like him visually, terms of haircut and stature and all of that. But he hasn't got that sort of air of menace about him is missing.
I think he has. He's got an. I would disagree with that to an extent. I think he's got the air of menace, but he hasn't got like the childlike quality. You
No.
know, Neil Maskell had a certain walk to him. He, the
Sure.
funny gait that made him different. The character different than the character seemed very, very, as I say, very childlike. Because he and Jessica both, as we know, certainly in the as characters in the British one, didn't have that childhood. And spoiler alert, they are siblings. Sorry, folks. They might not do that. It might be different in this version. They might not be siblings. They are siblings in the British version. I suppose the other thing that I wanted to mention was when we get on to episode 2, there are 2 characters that are introduced that weren't in the original version, and that intrigued me. I don't know enough to continue watching, but to see what they do, because first of all, I suppose they've got rid of the character of Dugdale, and he, was this politician who was having an affair, and that was all set up with the people behind the assassination, which we still haven't met yet, like the network, and if they're going to do that sort of thing. In the place of, I suppose, away from this main story, we've got John Cusack playing Dr. Kevin Christie. He was a geneticist or a biologist who's now created this totally organic meat substitute, which is being linked to these flus that are killing off school children in different areas of America. And then we've got Rainn Wilson playing a character called Michael Stearns, who is a scientist who discovered a strain of flus 7 years ago and is now sort of whistling away in a laboratory in a university. People have forgotten about him, but then it seems that this new strain of flu looks very similar to the one he discovered. It's got like a T shape on the forehead, and actually both of those storylines were very intriguing to me because it was something new. It's an odd balancing act, I think, in remaking a show, that you want to get that inbuilt audience who are like me and you going to go back and see, well, what have they done differently? What have they kept? What is the context of this? And what they are doing to make their show seem new. And they are 2 actors that I really like as well, which helps, I suppose.
I would agree with you. That kind of intrigued me. And you could kind of turn off all your utopianness with them.
It feels like a different series, though, doesn't it? And I know, obviously, they're going to combine the stories and shrink them down as they go on. I mean, I would like to see this series where John Cusack's playing this scientist who's creating food that's causing flu, and Rainn Wilson's the scientist who's going to save the day.
It would probably be on National Geographic Channel, but yes. I also wanted to touch on one of the things I always remember, and you spoke of a lot in the early days of Utopia, was the score, the sort of sound elements around it, and this didn't really have any of that, did it? At least the first episode didn't have its own unique sound atmosphere.
The electronic sort of like really extreme sounds to add to the whole, as I said again, I'm going to keep using this word, the whole aesthetic that the UK version had. I think what they've tried to do here is the American Utopia, I suppose, is the suburban lifestyle. It's very soft lighting on these rows of houses and what's going on beneath the surface. I suppose that's it, isn't it? It's the American Utopia. Their idea is this: 2 cars in every garage, 2 up, 2 down, the normal family who should live here, but there's a lot of other things going on beneath the surface, and that's, I think, what they've gone for here. And we should, I don't know if you have you mentioned that it was Gillian Flynn
yes, I did.
Who's written this? We really liked Sharp Objects, didn't we? Which was her book, which she'd adapted, and she'd also done Gone Girl as well. This feels like an odd thing for her to take on, based on her previous.
And she's the only constant. We know, even when it was with HBO, it was going to be with her, I believe. So she's stuck with it all the way through its various incarnations.
I think you needed someone like David Fincher, who directed Gone Girl, who has got that visual flair and that visual eye, and I think it would have been something different with David Fincher. I mean, it did intrigue me, and I did want to watch the second episode based on what had happened in the first, and based on the fact that the 2 characters who we promised, John Cusack and Rainn Wilson, whose names were both in the credits but weren't in the first episode. I wanted to see how their characters interacted. One of the performances I will praise is Javon Walton, who played Grant, because his story was actually completely separate from the rest of the gang, if you will, and I thought he did a really good job. There's that scene where he's trying to break into the penthouse suite and tries to convince the desk clerk that it's his dad and he's been left out.
That was the bit that I was most invested in. Mm-hmm. Is the bit where he's messing around like Richie Rich in this penthouse.
Or Home Alone 2, Lost in New York. That's what that was.
And then everything goes wrong, and he's forced to hide behind this screen, and he witnesses all the violence, but is able to escape with Utopia. That felt like it's when it kicked into a gear that I hoped it would have kicked in sooner. And also, I wonder, it's ironic that the amount of time it's taken to come to screen, it happens to land during a global pandemic when it's talking about
the killer flu, isn't it? And I think they do flash up any similarities to current events are coincidental or whatever, and we do not want to upset anyone.
Yeah, so I wonder how many people would just put off by that being the kind of backdrop as well, and just thinking this is too close in a way to what we're living through, and I don't want to be thinking about scientists in laboratories fiddling about with DNA and coding to get us another flu. So maybe it's that. It didn't have the pizzazz that I thought it would have, and that was a disappointment. Not the worst out of TV I watched this week.
No. It kept a pace for me. I wasn't bored, and I watched the first 2 episodes, so there you go. But, I think it's something that you have to decide for yourself, really.
I would still urge people, if they want to see Utopia, I would still urge them to see ours. But this is far easier if you are an Amazon subscriber.
And again, I don't know if we mentioned this, is that it never got its finale, did Utopia? Dennis Kelly, I think, asked if he could do like a one-off or a 2-parter, because he had the ending in mind, and we never ever got that. So it's one of those that's sort of unfinished, a show that was cancelled before the creator got to show his vision for the end. So that's a bit of a down note to end on.
Well, that was the one thing. I wanted to like it so that I could see what their version of the ending was. It might give me a degree of closure, but I don't like it enough. I spent a lot of the time while we were talking about it today thinking I really would like to go back and watch the original
me too.
Utopia. Yeah.
Me too.